did a little more research. I found some interesting things about, found some other interesting insights, or at least just fun anecdotes about Theodore Roosevelt that I think reveal a certain kind of affinity for the Jewish community. First of all, you might know this, but you know the story of the teddy bear, which comes from Teddy Roosevelt, when he wasn't such a good hunter, and somebody felt bad for him when he was on a hunting party, so they tied a cub bear to a tree that he could shoot, but he didn't shoot it because he thought it would be too easy, you know, and he felt sympathy for the bear. And so when that story leaked to the press, he got the nick, it was well known. So this Jewish couple named Rose Mictum and her husband Morris, they were recent immigrants from Russia. They had opened a store that sold just little, you know, trinkets. And they were so inspired by the story that they created the stuffed bear that she named Teddy. And that's where the teddy bear comes from. It was a Jewish couple that heard that story, and they in fact sent the first teddy bear to Teddy Roosevelt, and he approved of it. He also, throughout his life, you know, he grew up just a few blocks from the Lower East Side. And so he had exposure to the Jewish community growing up. There's a story that I came across that when he was police commissioner of New York, there was a well-known conversionary preacher from Germany who came to New York trying to convert Jews to Christianity. And he was very well known, and he needed police protection while he was there, you know, because he was this visiting dignitary. So Theodore Roosevelt, instead of speaking out, he didn't say this person's not welcome in New York. Instead, he made all of his bodyguards Jewish police officers. So this anti-Semitic preacher was surrounded by Jewish cops while he was giving his anti-Semitic sermons. So he probably toned down his language a little bit. So Roosevelt had a kind of sympathy for the Jews. And in fact, he was the first president to appoint a Jewish member of the cabinet. He appointed Oscar Strauss, who was the Secretary of Commerce and Labor. And he was very close with Strauss. In fact, they shared a ticket. Oscar Strauss is, of course, from the Strauss family that founded Macy's. And they shared a ticket in 1908 when, was it 1908 or no, a little later, 1908, when or 1912, when Roosevelt was elected president and Strauss was on the ticket running for governor of New York, but Strauss lost, whereas Roosevelt won. And then, of course, he was president during the Kishinev pogrom, and he did speak out, although it didn't really change anything. But he was at least probably up until that point, he was the president that had the closest connections to the Jewish community. Other presidents before him didn't have the connection that he did. Yeah, Marilyn.
I had read that when he was the police commissioner in New York, he admired the immigrants' hard work.
Yes.
And the fact that some of them even physically took up boxing and wrestling, and he called his police force the Jewish ones, the Maccabees. And
that's very possible. I didn't know that. That's
he called them the Maccabees, and so that's why he quickly sent them, as you say, for that story, which I also had read.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Now, following Roosevelt was William Howard Taft, who Roosevelt nurtured. Roosevelt chose him as his successor. Remember, Roosevelt served 2 terms, and he wanted Taft to succeed him. Taft had never really been interested in politics. Taft wanted to be a judge, which he ultimately was, but he was kind of roped in to politics. And Taft mainly grew up in Cincinnati, which is quite interesting. He attended the church across the street from Isaac Mayer Wise from Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati. You know, Isaac Mayer Wise built Plum Street Temple as this monumental, beautiful synagogue in downtown Cincinnati. And he deliberately built it across the street and in the same area as the major Catholic church and the major Protestant church. So according to his biography, Taft as a kid would occasionally go with his father to see Isaac Mayer Wise preach and give sermons. So he had a relationship with Isaac Mayer Wise. And in fact, he was friendly with other Jews in Cincinnati. And William Howard Taft, this is a good trivia answer. He was the first president to attend a Passover Seder while in office. It's an interesting fact. No one had attended a Passover Seder before. And this gives me room to tell a little bit of a story about a great Passover Seder I attended. I'll tell you this story. It was in 1999 or 1998? I think it must have been 1998. So I was invited to one of my professors' house at Stanford for a Seder. He lived on campus in this sort of area of townhouses on the Stanford campus. I pull up, I park, and I'm walking to the door, and two huge security guards standing right outside the door. So I said, oh, this is interesting. I walk in. Who is a guest at the Seder but Chelsea Clinton? And Chelsea's boyfriend at the time, who ultimately became her husband, Mark Mizvinsky. And so I sat across her, and we kind of knew each other. She was a history major. I was a history major. So we knew each other a little bit. We were in one class together. But anyways, I remember I was pouring the wine, and I was pouring everyone's wine, and I was so scared I was going to spill it. You know, is my hand going to shake? I better not spill this wine. But anyways, we were talking, and she said that she had attended a Passover Seder every year of her life. So she and her family would always go to Passover Seders. Obviously her husband is Jewish. And so it's an interesting story from the very first Passover Seder attended by a president to consistent Passover Seders throughout one's life. Taft was close with other prominent Jewish leaders. Another person that he was had a very wonderful relationship with was Mayer Sulzberger. Of course, Mayer Sulzberger, that's the same family as the New York Times, but Mayer Sulzberger was a judge also in Philadelphia. And Taft admired his jurisprudence. Taft was a major, he believed that Sulzberger was one of the great judges of his generation. So there was a lot of respect. Another person that Taft had an especially good relationship with, another interesting Jewish trivia question, the first president to actually stay overnight in the White House, first Jew actually to stay overnight in the White House was Julius Rosenwald. He was invited by William Howard Taft, who spent an evening and stayed overnight at the White House. He actually wrote to his wife on White House stationery on the evening of February 28th, 1912. Just think of it. Here I find your best fellow going to bed in the White House. I didn't dream of it. Good night, my dear girl. I wish you were here with me to enjoy the experience. Maybe someday we will be here together as guests during the president's second term. He wrote that to his wife. Rosenwald was supportive of Taft. And the reason Taft felt especially close to Rosenwald is Taft was a Republican. And even then, although, there was a tension. Eastern European Jews generally supported Democrats. The German Jews generally supported Republicans. But by that time, by the election of William Howard Taft, the number of Jews from Eastern Europe far outnumbered the number of Jews who had emigrated from Germany. So the Jewish community's support was shifting towards Democrats. But here, Julius Rosenwald is supportive of William Howard Taft. So there was a kind of a strong feeling. And Rosenwald was universally respected and beloved by the Jewish community. I mean, there was probably very few people who had negative things to say about him. And of course, many of you probably know, but Julius Rosenwald was here in Chicago. He was the head of Sears Roebuck, and for many, many years. And he was sort of the Jeff Bezos of his generation, creating the first catalog, and kind of making Sears the kind of Amazon of its time, or Amazon, the Sears of today. But he was very philanthropic. He was a member of Chicago Sinai congregation, where he was treasurer of the congregation for many years, for something like 30 years. And according to lore, whenever the discussion of the budget would come up at the board meeting, he would simply stand up and say, the budget is fine, and if it's not, I'll make it fine, and that's it. That was the treasurer's report every year. Must be nice. So that was, and then he was also extremely, Rosenwald was not only, supportive in Jewish affairs, but he built several thousand schools for African Americans all over the country. In fact, there's a whole movie about this. His grandson, Peter Ascoli, lives in Hyde Park, and he wrote a biography of Julius Rosenwald. It's a wonderful book. It's kind of long, but it's a fascinating story of that family. Yeah, Neil and then Alice.
This is all hearsay evidence, but being in the apparel business, it was kind of a well-known factoid that Sears didn't hire Jews. And supposedly the reason for this, which I heard, was he had felt discrimination against him in the industry, or anti-Semitism, and that he didn't want his executives to be in that position.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I did not know that. Wow. Yeah, I mean, the apparel business is so interesting. I forget where I was reading this. Oh yeah, we were going to talk about this when we talk about Woodrow Wilson, but I'll just bring it up now. I mean, the apparel business, there were Jews, obviously, who were owners of factories and who were workers in factories. And there was a very famous fire, the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, where most of the employees were Eastern European immigrants, and the owner was a German Jewish family, and 103 people died because these factories used to lock the doors so that workers wouldn't leave and steal stuff. And then you had to get permission to get up and go to the bathroom, and a fire broke out, and all the workers inside died. It was a horrible thing. And Louis Brandeis was sort of one of the negotiators between owners and workers after that. But we'll get to that. But the apparel business, very interesting, very interesting. Alice.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I read Preservation Magazine, which is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And there have been a lot of Rosenwald schools that have been renovated and saved. It's wonderful. I mean, they're all over the South. And I've read more than once that a lot of them have been saved. So that's really good. I mean, that was a massive thing that he did. It was, and I'm just wondering in relation to, I don't know what the relationship, if there was any national thing, you know what I'm saying? I don't know if Taft and Rosenwald had anything, if Taft was involved with that at all. I don't know.
I don't think so, because it happened later. It was more, I think Rosenwald built the schools later.
Oh, okay.
I think from what I understand, most Jews in 1912 supported, in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt supported Taft. Taft was his successor. But remember, there weren't term limits back then. So then in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt ran for president again against his, and many
Yeah.
Jews supported Roosevelt,
Oh,
but Rosenwald supported Taft. He stayed. He's essentially so I think Taft kind of felt, even though obviously Taft lost that and Woodrow Wilson won, they had a close relationship. In fact, yeah, it was. In February 1912, that was a month before Taft left office, that he invited Rosenwald to stay at the White House. So it was kind of like, almost like a parting gift, you know, that you supported me, I lost, but you know, here, come enjoy a night at the White House, you know, as a thank you. So yeah, I think that was part of the relationship. Rosenwald, it would be worth actually, you know, learning more about him. There's a great documentary. I watched it about 6 or 7 years ago, so I don't remember all of it, but it talks about his life and these schools and interviews people that graduated from those schools. You know, I think most of them have died, but there are a few left who essentially, Rosenwald was not only successful in business, he was a very successful philanthropist. And what do I mean a successful philanthropist? First of all, the schools weren't called Rosenwald schools. Some people call them that now, but they weren't called that. They were just called whatever, you know, I think the name related to the town or something. As you probably know, the Museum of Science and Industry was donated by Rosenwald, and they wanted to call it the Rosenwald Museum, and he said, no, do not. He didn't want it called the Rosenwald Museum. Now, there might be a couple reasons for that. First, maybe it's out of humility. That's probably one of the reasons. But a second reason is, if it was called that, then people might think that it's not the public's responsibility to maintain the museum. That, oh, we'll just go get money from the Rosenwald family because it's their museum. He didn't want that to be the case. He wanted this to be something that was for the public, not his museum, so to speak. So in that way, he was a very thoughtful philanthropist. And evidently, this is what he was very inspired by his rabbi, Emil Hirsch. He was a regular attendee. You know, sometimes you get people that are Jewish but they never go to services, and you know, they're prominent Jews. Maybe he went to services every Sunday. Of course, it was Sunday services back then. So he went to services every Sunday, and evidently he was very inspired by the social action message that he heard. Yeah, Sue?
So when I was a child, it was called the Rosenwald Museum. It did have that name, and it was only later that they changed it to the Museum of Science and Industry.
Are you sure that was that might have been known in the community as the Rosenwald Museum?
And that's what it was. I'm sure. I mean, look, I'm not an authority, but
we should look that up.
Sure.
We should look that up.
I'm going to look it up right now.
Yeah, look at it. I mean, I know I've heard that before, that people called it the Rosenwald Museum, but I don't know if it was official. I think that was more like people in the know called it that. I don't know whether it was officially. You might be right. You might be right. It might have officially been known that, and then maybe later on he's decided to change it. But I know that was intentionally later, either initially or later, it was known. He didn't want it to be known as the Rosenwald Museum.
I seem to remember, though, there being some publicity about the name change.
You might be right.
And I don't know, but I'm going to look it up right now.
I mean, that's a very interesting question when it comes to philanthropy, right? What things are named. Obviously, we know that in Jewish tradition, the highest form of charity is anonymous. Well, the highest form is giving somebody a job, but in terms of giving, the highest form is anonymous. Now, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that non-anonymous charity is not good. It's not that giving, any kind of giving is good. If you want your name attached to it, that's fine. And there is an argument to be made that giving with a name is actually good, because it can inspire others to give, right? And you can take pride in giving. However, for those who have the humility to give anonymously, it's a great thing, you know? And although, you know, even if he didn't call it the Museum of Science and Industry, it's not that he gave anonymously. People knew, obviously. So there's a great episode of that show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, where somebody is chasing Larry David, and Larry David tries to get into the museum, but the museum is closed, and he gave a gift to the museum, but he gave it anonymously, and he's knocking on the door, and he wants the police officer to let him in, but the police officer says, "I'm closed." And then Larry David points at the wall and says, "I'm anonymous. I'm anonymous," you know, and he's trying to get him to, it's very funny. Okay, Marilyn, go ahead.
Yeah, just a little trivia, and I don't know if this is factual or not, but was he not a very heavy man, like 350 pounds?
Yes, very heavy. Yes.
Okay, and then
Unhealthy.
other trivia that I remember, he was the first president to ever throw the pitch out at the baseball game.
Yes, I've heard that too. I've heard that too. He's also the only president who was also a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Right, so he was the only president who had an executive and a judicial position.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's really important. And then the other part of trivia about him that I know it or heard is that he's responsible for the 3,000 cherry trees in Washington, D.C. I don't know if that's true or not.
It might be. It might, I don't know. I know that was a gift from Japan initially. It might have been.
But he might have been the
Yeah.
one to have to accept that gift. I don't know, but I
Very
heard he
possible.
was the one who.
He also spoke out against Henry Ford, which was brave. In 1920, he gave a speech at the Anti-Defamation League here in Chicago, actually, right after Ford published the International Jew, you know, which was his essentially reprinting of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And Taft said, there is not the slightest ground for anti-Semitism among us. It is a vicious plant. It is a noxious weed that should be cut out. It has no place in free America, and the men who seek to introduce it should be condemned by public opinion. So that was pretty brave. Okay, now, Taft runs in 1912. So does Theodore Roosevelt, and so does Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson wins this three-way race. Taft probably would have won if it had just been a Taft versus Wilson, but Theodore Roosevelt pulled votes away from Taft, and so Wilson wins. Wilson is fascinating in that he grew up with, his father was a very prominent Presbyterian minister and very devout. So Woodrow Wilson grows up with a very deep religiosity and strong theological convictions. Now, one might think that's a negative in terms of relationship with the Jews, but it actually was a positive for Wilson, because he really believed in the chosen people and the Old Testament, the truth of the Old Testament. And as we'll see, he was, helped ensure the passage, the issuance of the Balfour Declaration in Britain. He was supportive of it and so forth, which ultimately establishes the basis for the state of Israel. So not only did he have these strong theological convictions, but he was a deep admirer of Jews. In fact, he said, "Here is a great body of our Jewish citizens from whom have sprung men of genius in every walk of our varied life, men who have conceived of its ideals with singular clarity and led enterprises with spirit and sagacity. They are not Jews in America, they are American Jews." Interesting. Okay, so Wilson goes from being president of Princeton to governor of New Jersey to president. The Jewish person to whom Wilson is closest, and I think I might have mentioned this before, is Louis Brandeis. Now, how the reason they first started a relationship because Brandeis was a very successful lawyer, and he wrote a book in 1914. Brandeis did, called "Other People's Money," and Brandeis argued in this book that tariffs should be reduced and more competition should be introduced in a society, and that his thinking, Brandeis's thinking, impressed Wilson tremendously. Brandeis also talked about the power of these trusts, sort of monopolies, and Wilson agreed with Brandeis's view of trust. And so Wilson essentially admired Brandeis's clarity and his politics. And ultimately, when Wilson had the opportunity to appoint a justice to the Supreme Court, he chose Brandeis over tremendous opposition. Now, this is quite interesting. I mean, we take for granted now that Supreme Court nominations are controversial, but before then, they weren't so controversial. But immediately upon the nomination of Brandeis, there was tremendous opposition. He was considered radical, and many people who sympathized with his politics, Brandeis's politics, were anti-Semitic. In fact, there's a story that one of Woodrow Wilson's friends said, "Isn't it a shame, Mr. President, that a man as great as Mr. Justice Brandeis should be a Jew?" To which the president responded, "But he would not be Mr. Brandeis if he were not a Jew." Many people opposed him, but Wilson, see, the thing about Wilson that was both his strength and his Achilles heel was that he was once he was stubborn. Once he decided on a path, he didn't back down from that path. And that was ultimately his undoing. Remember the League of Nations, which comes later, which is extremely unpopular in America. But Wilson goes to his deathbed committed to the League of Nations. But he was so committed to Brandeis's nomination that he said, "I cannot speak too highly of his impartial, impersonal, orderly, and constructive mind, his rare analytical powers, his deep human sympathy, his profound acquaintance with the historical roots of our institutions, and insight into their spirit, or of the many evidences he has given of being imbued to the very heart of our American ideals of justice and equality of opportunity, of his knowledge of modern economic conditions and the way they bear upon the masses of the people. The friend of justice and of men will ornament the high court of which we are so justly proud." Wow. So he clearly thought extremely highly of Brandeis, and it took 4 months. I mean, that's an extremely long time to get Brandeis's nomination through, and Brandeis only won his nomination by 47 to 22, and so that was one of, and of course he's the first Jewish person appointed to the Supreme Court, and Brandeis profoundly influenced Woodrow Wilson in many ways, because even by that time, Brandeis is known as a very successful lawyer, but by that time, he's also a profoundly influential Zionist. Now, the interesting thing, and I think I mentioned this a little bit last week, was that Brandeis grew up completely assimilated. I mean, probably never stepped foot in a synagogue, knew he was Jewish, but was quite an assimilated family. And by the way, his descendants are also, about half of Brandeis' descendants are Christian and the other half are Jewish. I think he has somebody told me he has like a granddaughter who's in her 70s, who is a attorney in Chicago and is a member of Temple Shalom. But that's the Jewish side of the family. There's a whole part of the family that's also Christian. So Brandeis really grows up very assimilated, but he becomes influenced by a Zionist writer named Jacob de Haas. Jacob de Haas is the editor of the Boston Jewish Advocate newspaper. And Jacob de Haas was influenced by Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl, of course, is the proponent of the Jewish state. And Brandeis believed that a Jewish state would represent and embody all the ideals of democracy and morality that he saw at the heart of Judaism. So he believed that a Jewish state would embody everything positive and good about Judaism. Now, one could argue that his vision was quite idealistic. It wasn't realistic. He sort of romanticized Judaism and the Jewish people, and that's easier to do when you're not acquainted with something personally. It's easy to romanticize it, which is he was probably guilty of doing. But he certainly was influential in that he brought a kind of credibility to Zionism. Here's this very prominent American Jew, respected by so many people, who's also profoundly a deeply committed Zionist. Brandeis has a very strong relationship with somebody named Horace Callan. Who's an expert on Horace Callan? I don't know if Alan Green is on our call, but Alan Green's son, Danny Green, wrote a book essentially about Callan. Horace Callan was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and he was a kind of a sociologist, and he was the first person to kind of criticize the notion of the melting pot. He said, America is not really a melting pot, it's more like a symphony, where each ethnic group plays its own notes. And the sound comes out as one, but he believed in he called it cultural pluralism, that there were different cultures and ethnicities, and they each contributed on their own, and weren't melted away. And Brandeis had an extensive correspondence with Callan, and he believed that Jews were an ethnic group in that same way, and that playing their note in the symphony was creating a Jewish state based on Jewish ideals. So Brandeis articulated all this, and he served as a major leader of the Zionist movement, including while he was on the Supreme Court. I mean, he didn't do official things while on the Supreme Court, but he would lend his name and his credibility. Now, back to Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson appoints Brandeis to the Supreme Court, but then we have World War I. Of course, Wilson ultimately, America ultimately gets involved in World War I. And when the tide is turned, who ends up with control of the area known as Palestine, but the British? British ultimately, the Ottoman Empire loses control. Britain controls this area. And what is Britain to do with this area it controls? Well, it was a big question. And one of the most important Zionists was a British Jew named Hayem Weitzman. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Hayem Weitzman. He was the first president of Israel. But Hayem Weitzman was also a chemist, very successful chemist. And he helps develop I didn't really quite understand this until I was doing a little more research, but here, I'll just read this. By 1916, Britain was having a difficult time fending off attacks by the Germans, who had learned how to manufacture high explosives. Acetone was the key ingredient, and the Germans had cornered the market on this highly desirable chemical. The British military turned to Hayem Weitzman to find a substitute for acetone. After a year of testing and experimentation, Weitzman had discovered a formula for extracting acetone from chestnuts. Before long, children all over Britain were scouring the countryside for chestnuts, so badly needed to wage war. Years later, Lloyd George, the prime minister, would write in his memoirs, "I felt a debt of gratitude, and so did all of the allies, to the brilliant scientific genius of Dr. Weitzman. When we talked to him and asked him, 'What can we do for you in the way of honors?' he replied, 'All I care for is an opportunity to do something for my people.' It was worth anything to us in honor or in the coin of the realm, but all he asked for was to be allowed to present his case for the restoration of his people to the old country, which they had made famous throughout the world. So essentially, Weitzman, through his scientific skills and his political savvy, ultimately persuades Lloyd George and then ultimately Arthur Balfour to issue this declaration known as the Balfour Declaration that expresses the British government's support for the eventual establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And this is in 1917. It's considered the sort of earliest official government support for a Jewish state. Now, how does this relate to Wilson? Well, Wilson initially supports, before it's even issued, Wilson supports the idea of the Balfour Declaration, primarily because of Brandeis and other Jews. However, the State Department in America opposes it. Big surprise. State departments generally filled with anti-Semites back then. Also, Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor, essentially his chief of staff, was someone named Colonel Edward House. Edward House was an anti-Semite. He didn't like Jews. And so House opposes this. And Wilson, of course, caught in a political quagmire. Louis Brandeis invites Weitzman to come to America, and together they meet with Wilson to try to persuade him. Also included was Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was a friend of Brandeis. They meet. In fact, it was on May 6th, Brandeis himself met with Wilson and discussed, this is May 6, 1917, and discussed the details of the declaration being proposed. Wilson expressed his accord with the overall content of the document. This is a draft of the Balfour Declaration. And Wilson said, whenever the time comes and you and Justice Brandeis feel that the time is right for me to speak out, I shall be ready. Ultimately, however, he's persuaded not to say anything until the Balfour Declaration is ultimately made public in November of that year. November 2nd, 1917 is when it's issued. And later on, Wilson says, how proud I am that because of the teachings instilled in me by my father, the Presbyterian minister, it has been my privilege to restore the Holy Land to its rightful owners. So again, this is clearly the fact that Woodrow Wilson had a deep respect and relationship with Louis Brandeis helped ensure that the Balfour Declaration had the support of the US government when it was issued by Britain. That might not have happened without Brandeis. Now, interestingly, the relationship between Brandeis and Hayem Weitzman totally collapses. And it's an interesting reason why. So Brandeis, even though he's such a prominent supporter of Zionism, many Jews, especially those not in America, did not like him because he was seen as aloof, which he probably was. It was just his character. But he was also seen as not really a true Jew in his gut, that he was, he never, he grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, in a totally assimilated family. Hayem Weitzman grew up in a shtetl. And most of the other Zionists grew up in shtetls in Poland and Ukraine. And they looked at Brandeis and said, he's not really one of us. And they kind of, ultimately what happened was Brandeis wanted to keep the non-Zionist German Jews like Louis Marshall and Jacob Schiff, and also Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald was not a Zionist. Later on, but people like that who were sort of these distinguished American Jewish citizens, but who were not, they didn't grow up in shtetls. Brandeis wanted to keep them within the Zionist fold. Hayem Weitzman said, we don't want them. We can build our own state. We don't need these, people who think they're better than us, who think they know everything. they're not part of our movement. This is a movement of the people. And so ultimately, Weitzman and Brandeis clash, and ultimately Weitzman wins. Brandeis just says, I'm out of here. I mean, he remains a supporter and, gives money to Israel and so forth, but the official Zionist movement in America is taken over by allies of Weitzman. This is in 1919, 1920. And at that point, Brandeis, who's on the Supreme Court, kind of backs away from official Jewish activities for the rest of his life. Again, he continues to give money and so forth, but he's not involved in the Jewish community. I mean, it's a fascinating story. There's a whole book written about this. I read, 10, 15 years ago. But this clash, it actually still has some implications, because American Jews have always been a little bit different than Jews in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, to be a Zionist was essentially to say you want to make Aliyah, ultimately. In Australia, in Britain, in other places, if you are a proud Zionist, that ultimately means you want to make Aliyah to Israel. In America, that hasn't really been the case. Very few American Jews make Aliyah. I mean, those who do it generally are Orthodox. There are some exceptions. My brother-in-law lives in Israel. He's certainly not Orthodox, but it's not common because American Jews feel at home in America. And Brandeis kind of represented that. Hayem Weitzman didn't really understand that. He's saying, Brandeis, that if you're going to be a Jew, you make Aliyah. That's sort of the ultimate goal. And so that clash in some ways still exists. There was about 10, 15 years ago, A.B. Yehoshua, the great Israeli author, he gave a speech to the American Jewish Committee where he basically said, you're not real Jews because you don't want to make Aliyah. And if you truly, if you stay in America, you're in exile. And he gave this speech in America to the American Jewish Committee. You can look it up, type in A.B. Yehoshua, American Jewish Committee. It was a very controversial speech, but he was sort of speaking for part of the psyche of Israel that kind of said, we are truly committed to this, and don't call yourself a true Zionist if you don't ultimately want to live in Israel. And Brandeis represented the counterpoint to that. And I think most American Jews are kind of on the Brandeis side of things, but that tension exists. Okay, questions before we talk a little bit more about Wilson? Any questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Marilyn, then Sue.
Well, you were talking about Wilson's upbringing, and being that he was raised in the South, he was very, very anti. He treated the Jews okay, but shame on him for the way he thought about the blacks.
Unadulterated racist.
Oh, terrible, terrible. And he didn't even want to appoint them. He didn't think that they were intelligent enough and hardworking enough, or whatever adjectives. I can't speak for him, but he was so indoctrinated by, I don't know if it was his family or prejudice in growing up in the South. Did he grow up in Virginia?
Let me see here.
I think so. But that was a terrible part of him to be so. I mean, fortunately, he was good to the Jews, but shame on him for the way he treated the blacks.
Yeah, no, he was terrible. He showed that movie, Birth of a Nation, about the Ku Klux Klan. He did a premiere in the White House of it. Yeah, he was a terrible. I mean, remember the politics of the time was the Southern Democrats, and the Southern Democrats were racist, and Wilson needed their votes. And so did FDR, by the way. I mean, that's a whole nother, FDR, it's ultimately Truman who integrates the army. But yeah, that was a kind of terrible part of our history. I mean, FDR, blacks are not included in the GI Bill. Well, they are veterans, but there's certain rules. The GI Bill was essentially allowed, it allowed zoning and things, mortgages to be based on neighborhood, and it ultimately created a lot of the segregated neighborhoods that we have now, especially in Chicago. There's a whole interesting book about this. But yes, you're absolutely right. That's a big taint on his legacy. Yeah, Sue.
I was going to say the same thing, so I have nothing more to say.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to assess people objectively. You know, we don't know. We can judge people, and I think justly so. Someone like Wilson clearly was racist. At the same time, the society was pretty racist, including people in the North. So we have to grapple with that wherever we are. A couple other interesting things about Wilson. He was close with Stephen Wise. Stephen Wise is a great rabbi of the time. He founded what's called the Free Synagogue in New York, now known as the Stephen Wise Synagogue. In fact, Cantor J was an intern there when he was in cantorial school. It's a beautiful congregation on the west side, the Upper West Side of New York. Wilson was quite impressed with Stephen Wise and his support. Interesting. Stephen Wise accompanied President Wilson to the Versailles Peace Treaty, the Versailles negotiations, and Stephen Wise gave a speech there. Wilson also had good relationships. You know, at this time,
let's take I-94 west.
There was also a lot of non-Zionist Jews. I kind of mentioned that. Brandeis wanted to keep them in the fold. Some of the most influential American Jews at that time were not supportive of Israel, but they had relationships with Wilson. One of them was Bernard Baruch, probably heard of him, Bernard Baruch. He was sort of the Wall Street titan of his day, grew up in Camden, South Carolina, but came to Wall Street. And, you know, by 1902, he had made over $3 million, which was a lot of money back then. I mean, it's not a small amount of money now, but back then it was a huge amount of money. And he was an advisor to Wilson, also accompanied Wilson to the Versailles Treaty. And in fact, when Wilson retired, Bernard Baruch loaned him money to buy his house. And then Bernard Baruch bought the property next door to where Woodrow Wilson lived so that Woodrow Wilson could enjoy some privacy. Probably not the most ethical act, although one could argue Wilson is already retired, so he could pretty much do whatever he wanted to. It doesn't really violate his ethics. But anyways, Wilson also is close with Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau was the chairman of the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee's Finance Committee, during the 1912 and 1916 campaigns for Wilson. That's a very important post. He was, Morgenthau was supportive of Wilson in the League of Nations. And also, interestingly, Morgenthau was basically the key person responsible for the establishment of the International Red Cross. One could say, what Red Cross? Some issues there, you know, that sometimes not the friendliest to Israel, but at that time, there were Jews especially supportive, and Morgenthau was one of them. Also, another very interesting friend of Wilson and prominent Jew was Paul Warburg. Some people say Paul Warburg was the model for Daddy Warbucks in the Annie production, but Paul Warburg is essentially the intellectual creator of the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve bank system, you probably know, you know, this sort of, it's not a government entity, it's a private entity, but its officials are appointed by the government. It's a very interesting creation, but essentially serves as the lender of last resort. In an economic downturn, the Federal Reserve provides money via the Treasury to help sustain an economy. And before the Federal Reserve, there were lots of boom and bust cycles in America, huge boom and bust cycles. I mean, well, even after the Federal Reserve, there are boom and bust cycles, but in its ideal function, the Federal Reserve helped smooth things out. Paul Warburg is essentially the creator of it because he came to America from Germany, and he's from, of course, the Warburg family, which is a banking family, kind of like the Rothschilds. And he looks at our financial system and said it's way too simplistic. And he worked with others, famously Senator Nelson Aldrich, Nelson Aldrich is a son-in-law of J.P. Morgan, or brother-in-law, I can't remember, but essentially helped create the modern financial system. And Woodrow Wilson appoints him to the Federal Reserve Board. He was the first vice chairman. He wasn't chairman probably because he was Jewish, and it would have been seen as, Jews controlling our financial system. So he was the vice chairman, but he was really the guiding light behind this creation and our current monetary system. So that was Woodrow Wilson, probably by then the most shaped and connected to the Jewish community of any president up until then, and then ultimately up until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I think his enduring legacy for Jews especially is the Balfour Declaration, that like Harry Truman, he was really pivotal at this moment when the state of Israel is in formation. And his relationship with Brandeis is a big part of that. And his appointment of Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Remember, there now are how many? There's Ilana Kagan, Stephen Breyer, who's retiring, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who obviously died. I mean, there have been many Jews on the Supreme Court. Probably right now is the fewest number of Jews on the Supreme Court in a long time, because it's just Ilana Kagan now, once Breyer steps down. But Brandeis was the first, and there were many who came after him. Not many, but a significant number. And that broke a major taboo. And it was one of the things that also did was it brought anti-Semitism out into the open. There was always anti-Semitism, of course, but here, when the first Jew was nominated to the Supreme Court, a lot of it came out in public and people saw it. And that didn't really die down until after World War II. What we're going to get to next week is really the 1930s was the peak of anti-Semitism in the United States. Arguably, even today, I mean, today there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but I don't think it compares to the 30s, at least to the degree. We have a larger population today, but there was a survey, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but in 1938 or 37, there was a survey of Americans. Basically, 20% of Americans said America would be much better off without Jews. I think you would be hard pressed to find even 5% of people who would say that today. Jews are generally, and so is Israel, popular in the United States, but in the 1930s it was not. And we'll get to that. Okay, one more comment, Sarah.
That's very interesting. Regarding Louis Brandeis and kind of toning down his Zionism later on, well, he had a very important position being the first Supreme Court justice. It was probably good that he didn't voice a lot of political opinions.
Yes, I think you're right about that. He couldn't do things overtly. Although there's a lot of evidence that behind the scenes, he exerted enormous influence with Roosevelt, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Was an advice. Back then, not everything was covered by the media in the way it is now. So Brandeis frequently met with FDR, even while he was on the Supreme Court. And so he played a role kind of behind the scenes in advancing Jewish interests. Interestingly, he became later near the end of his life, he was a very supporter of sort of the ardent Zionist wing he was a supporter of sort of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was essentially the person who led the bombing of the King David Hotel and was, let's get rid of the British. He was sort of an opponent of Ben-Gurion. He thought Ben-Gurion was too soft and too willing to negotiate. So Brandeis became even more ardent in his Zionism later in life, which is interesting. There's a kibbutz named after him. It's called Kfar Shoftim or Kfar Shofet, which means village of the judge. And it's named.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Next week, we will get, we'll follow Wilson. We'll talk about Warren Harding and then ultimately get through Roosevelt. So I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.